This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
Jane Eyre was a 10-year-old orphan, adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for her. She lived with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and cousins at Gateshead Hall, but it was far from a loving family environment. Gateshead Hall loomed over Jane like a giant, its stone walls cold and unforgiving. The sprawling gardens that surrounded the house, once a potential playground, now felt like the borders of a prison. Inside, ornate furnishings and plush carpets whispered of wealth and comfort. But for Jane, they only emphasized her status as an unwanted intruder. Every day, Jane navigated the halls like a mouse avoiding traps, her small frame hunched as if to make herself invisible. The air itself seemed thick with tension, carrying the weight of unspoken resentment. Mrs. Reed's cold eyes followed Jane's every move, narrowing with barely concealed contempt. The woman's lips would purse, as if holding back the words she longed to say. "You don't belong here." On a particularly dreary afternoon, when the rain lashed against the windows, like nature itself was trying to break in, Jane sought refuge in her uncle's library. The musty smell of old books embraced her as she curled up in a window seat, hidden behind heavy velvet curtains. The pages of an adventure story whisked her away from her miserable reality, each word a balm to her wounded spirit. But peace was a luxury Jane was rarely afforded. The curtains were suddenly yanked back, revealing the hulking form of her cousin, John Reed. His piggy eyes glinted with malice as he snatched the book from her hands. "What are you doing with my father's book, you little rat?" he snarled, his breath hot and sour in Jane's face. Before she could respond, pain exploded in her head as John's fist connected. The world spun, and Jane found herself sprawled against the window, the cold glass a shock against her skin. For a moment she lay there stunned, but then something deep within her snapped. Years of pent-up fury and injustice surged through her small body. With a cry that was more animal than human, Jane launched herself at John. Her tiny fist pummeled every inch of him she could reach. "I am not a rat," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "I have feelings, and I will not be treated this way." The commotion brought Mrs. Reed running, her skirts swishing ominously. Without a moment's hesitation, she grabbed Jane's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You wicked, disobedient child," Mrs. Reed hissed, her face a mask of shock and anger. "You'll be punished for this." Jane's heart pounded as she was dragged through the house, her feet barely touching the ground. The walls seemed to close in, the portraits of Reed ancestors glaring down at her in judgment. With a final rough shove, Jane found herself thrust into the red room. The door slammed shut with a sound of finality, the key turning in the lock like the ceiling of a tomb. Jane's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she took in her surroundings. This was the very chamber where her Uncle Reed had drawn his last breath, and the air felt heavy with unseen presences. Crimson light filtered through the heavy drapes, casting everything in a bloody glow. The furniture loomed like dark sentinels, their shadows stretching and shifting in the fading light. As night crept in, Jane's imagination ran wild. Every creak of the old house became a ghostly footstep, every shadow a reaching hand. In her mind's eye, she saw her uncle's pale face, his eyes accusing her of disturbing his rest. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in. Jane's chest tightened, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. A scream tore from her throat, born of terror and despair. She threw herself against the door, her small fists pounding with all her might. "Let me out! Please! Let me out!" But her cries echoed in the empty room, falling on deaf ears. The strain of her ordeal soon overwhelmed her. Jane's legs gave way, and she slid to the floor, consciousness slipping away like water through cupped hands. The darkness of the room merged with the darkness behind her eyelids, and Jane knew no more. When she next opened her eyes, it was to the concerned face of Mr. Lloyd, the family apothecary. His kind eyes and gentle touch were like a lifeline in a stormy sea. As Jane recounted her ordeal, her voice trembling, Mr. Lloyd's brow furrowed with concern. He turned to Mrs. Reed, who hovered nearby, her impatience palpable. "This child needs a change of environment," Mr. Lloyd said firmly, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "I suggest sending her to school. It would be best for her health and well-being." Mrs. Reed's eyes lit up at the prospect, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, of course," she agreed, barely concealing her eagerness. "I'll make arrangements immediately." As plans were set in motion to send Jane to Lowood Institution, a charity school for orphan girls, a whirlwind of emotions swept through her. Fear of the unknown battled with hope for a fresh start, away from the cruelty of Gateshead Hall. Whatever lay ahead, Jane knew it couldn't be worse than the life she was leaving behind. Little did she know that as she stood on the precipice of this new chapter in her life, fate had more trials in store. The biting wind that would soon whip around her as she stood before the imposing stone edifice of Lowood School was just the beginning. Those hollow-eyed windows would stare down at her, judging her worth before she'd even stepped inside, unaware of the strength that lay within the small, determined girl who had survived Gateshead Hall. The biting wind whipped around Jane as she stood before the imposing stone edifice of Lowood School. Its windows, like hollow eyes, seemed to stare down at her, judging her worth before she'd even stepped inside. Jane hugged herself tightly, seeking warmth that wasn't there, as she took her first tentative steps towards her new life. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, swallowing Jane into a world colder than the January air outside. The warmth she'd hoped for was replaced by a chill that settled deep in her bones. A chill born of strict rules and even stricter faces. The very walls seemed to whisper of discipline and conformity. Mr. Brocklehurst, the school's headmaster, loomed over Jane like a dark specter. His sharp features and cold eyes made her feel small and insignificant. Each word he spoke was like a hammer, chipping away at her sense of self-worth. Jane's heart raced, her palms grew clammy, and she fought the urge to run back out into the snow. Days blurred together in a haze of hunger and cold. The meager portions of food, if one could call it that, left Jane's stomach in a constant state of protest. The thin, threadbare uniforms did little to ward off the biting winter air that seeped through every crack and crevice of the old building. At night, Jane would curl up in her hard bed, shivering beneath the thin blankets, and dream of warmth and full bellies. Yet even as her body suffered, Jane's spirit remained unbroken. She threw herself into her studies with a fervor that surprised even herself. The feel of a pencil in her hand as she sketched brought a warmth to her heart that no fire could match. The lilting sounds of French on her tongue transported her far from the dreary walls of Lowood to sun-drenched fields and bustling Parisian streets she'd only read about in books. It was during one of these moments of quiet concentration that Miss Temple first noticed Jane. The superintendent's kind eyes and gentle smile were like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Under Miss Temple's guidance, Jane's talents flourished. She provided Jane with extra books, praised her progress, and most importantly, treated her with a respect that had been sorely lacking in her young life. The bond between Jane and Miss Temple grew stronger with each passing day. When Mr. Brocklehurst's accusations threatened to tarnish Jane's reputation, Miss Temple stood firm as her defender. Her unwavering support was a balm to Jane's wounded spirit, soothing the ache of loneliness and rejection that had been her constant companions. The true test of their relationship came with Mrs. Reed's visit to Lowood. The woman who had made Jane's childhood a misery now sought to poison her new life with lies. As Mrs. Reed's false claims of Jane being a liar echoed through the halls, Jane felt her world crumbling around her once more. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with tension. Jane's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she waited for the axe to fall. But Miss Temple, true to her nature, refused to accept these accusations at face value. She delved into the matter with the tenacity of a bloodhound, peeling back the layers of deceit until the truth shone through. When Miss Temple finally cleared Jane's name, it was as if a great weight had been lifted from the young girl's shoulders. The sun seemed to shine a little brighter, the air felt a little warmer, and for the first time since arriving at Lowood, Jane allowed herself to smile. As Jane stood in Miss Temple's office, basking in the warmth of vindication, she realized that even in the bleakest of places, hope could take root and flourish. The harsh conditions of Lowood still surrounded her, but now she had something to hold on to. The knowledge that she was valued, that her voice mattered, and that her future, once so uncertain, now held the promise of something brighter. That night, as Jane lay in her bed, her mind swirling with the events of the day, she heard a soft sound from the bed next to hers. A girl with kind eyes and a gentle smile was looking at her intently. "Hello," the girl whispered. "I'm Helen Burns. I couldn't help but notice how brave you were today." Jane's heart leapt at the prospect of a friend, but little did she know that this chance encounter would change the course of her life at Lowood forever. Jane's life at Lowood took an unexpected turn. It was there that she met Helen Burns, a fellow student who would become her closest friend. The stark contrast between the two girls was immediately apparent. Jane, with her fiery spirit, was like a tempestuous flame, her emotions flickering and dancing at the slightest provocation. Helen, on the other hand, exuded a serene calmness, her presence as steady and soothing as a still lake on a windless day. In the drafty halls of Lowood, where the chills seemed to seep into one's very bones, Helen's gentle voice became a balm for Jane's troubled soul. "You mustn't let their cruelty harden your heart, Jane," Helen would often say, her eyes shining with a wisdom that belied her young age. The soft cadence of her words seemed to chase away the shadows that lurked in the corners of Jane's mind. Jane watched in awe as Helen endured the harsh treatment at Lowood with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Where Jane's fists would clench and her cheeks flush with righteous anger at the injustices they faced, Helen would simply bow her head, accepting her fate with a quiet dignity that left Jane speechless. Their friendship blossomed like a delicate flower pushing through cracks in concrete, finding beauty in the most unlikely of places. Late at night, when the rest of the school was shrouded in darkness and silence, their whispered conversations became a lifeline, anchoring them in a sea of loneliness and despair. But the fragile peace they had found was not destined to last. A dark cloud descended upon Lowood in the form of a typhus epidemic, its tendrils of sickness reaching into every corner of the school. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of illness and fear, the once bustling corridors now eerily quiet, save for the occasional cough or moan of pain. Jane found herself by Helen's bedside, watching helplessly as her friend's life ebbed away like sand through an hourglass. The room was heavy with the scent of sickness and impending loss, but Helen's face remained serene, a small smile playing on her lips, even as her breath grew labored. "Don't be afraid for me, Jane," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her ragged breathing. "I'm going to a better place. Remember what I taught you about forgiveness and peace?" Jane clutched Helen's hand, feeling the warmth slowly fading from her friend's skin. Tears streamed down her face, each one a silent tribute to the friendship that was slipping away before her eyes. As the light faded from Helen's eyes, Jane felt a piece of her own heart wither and die. In the wake of the epidemic, public outrage erupted like a long-dormant volcano. The deplorable conditions at Lowood were thrust into the harsh light of scrutiny, and an investigation was launched. Mr. Brocklehurst, once so proud and imperious, was stripped of his position, his fall from grace as swift and merciless as his treatment of the students had been. Under new management, Lowood underwent a transformation that was nothing short of miraculous. The halls that had once echoed with the sounds of misery and hunger now rang with the laughter of well-fed, cared-for children. The changes were like a breath of fresh air, sweeping away the cobwebs of neglect and cruelty that had for so long defined the school. Jane remained at Lowood for 6 more years, her experiences there shaping her into a capable young woman. She threw herself into her studies with a fervor born of determination, honing her skills and expanding her knowledge. The pages of her books became her refuge, each word a stepping stone on her path to a better future. Eventually, Jane took on the role of a teacher at the institution, guiding young minds just as she had once been guided. As she stood before her class, she often felt Helen's presence beside her, a gentle reminder of the lessons in forgiveness and inner strength that had become the foundation of her character. Miss Temple, another influential figure in Jane's life, eventually left Lowood to get married. Her departure was like the closing of a chapter, marking the end of Jane's formative years at the school. As Jane watched Miss Temple's carriage disappear down the road, the clip-clop of hooves fading into the distance, she felt a mixture of sadness and excitement for the future that lay ahead. Standing at the gates of Lowood, Jane looked back at the building that had been her home for so many years. It was no longer the place of fear and hardship it had once been, but a symbol of resilience and growth. With Helen's wisdom in her heart and Miss Temple's guidance in her mind, Jane felt a stirring in her soul, a restlessness that whispered of new horizons and untold adventures. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jane felt a sudden, overwhelming urge for change. The walls of Lowood, once so imposing, now seemed to close in around her. Her spirit, long tempered by hardship and loss, now yearned for something more. With her 18th birthday approaching, Jane found herself standing on the precipice of a new chapter in her life, her heart pounding with the possibility of what lay beyond the familiar confines of the school. What adventures awaited her in the world beyond Lowood's gates? After 2 years of teaching at Lowood, Jane's spirit yearned for change. At 18, she felt a burning desire to broaden her horizons and seek new experiences beyond the familiar walls of the institution. The air in Jane's small room felt thick with anticipation as she sat at her desk, quill in hand. Her heart raced as she carefully penned an advertisement for a position as a governess. Each word felt like a step towards freedom, a chance to break free from the confines of her current life. Days stretched into weeks, each sunrise bringing a flicker of hope that quickly faded with the setting sun. Jane's dreams teetered on the edge of possibility, her mind a whirlwind of what-ifs and maybes. Then, like a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds, a letter arrived from Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield Hall. Jane's world exploded with color. The drab grays of Lowood melted away, replaced by vibrant hues of possibility. Her hands trembled as she read and reread the letter, each word etching itself into her memory. Without hesitation, she accepted the position, her mind already racing with visions of her new life. As Jane packed her meager belongings, a mixture of excitement and fear coursed through her veins. Each item she placed in her trunk felt like a piece of her old life being left behind. The unknown beckoned, both thrilling and terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to take flight. The journey to Thornfield was a sensory overload. The clip-clop of horse hooves, the creak of carriage wheels, the rush of wind against her face. Every sound, every sensation was new and exhilarating. Jane's eyes darted from one sight to another, drinking in the world beyond Lowood's gates like a parched traveler at an oasis. As the carriage rolled up to the imposing manor, Jane's breath caught in her throat. Thornfield Hall loomed before her, a grand old dame with secrets hiding in her shadows. The stone walls seemed to whisper tales of ages past, while ivy clung to the facade like nature, trying to reclaim what was once hers. Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, greeted Jane with a warmth that instantly melted the ice of her nervousness. The older woman's kind eyes and gentle manner were a balm to Jane's frayed nerves. As they walked through the halls of Thornfield, Jane couldn't help but notice the air of neglect that hung over the place, like a fine layer of dust on once polished surfaces. "Your pupil will be Adele Varan," Mrs. Fairfax explained, her voice echoing in the vast rooms. "She's the ward of Mr. Edward Rochester, the master of Thornfield." Jane's curiosity was piqued, a spark of interest igniting in her chest. "And Mr. Rochester, will I meet him soon?" A shadow passed over Mrs. Fairfax's face, quick as a cloud across the sun. "Oh, he's often away. Thornfield isn't his favorite place, I'm afraid." As days turned into weeks, Jane found herself settling into a rhythm at Thornfield. Teaching Adele brought her joy, the girl's lively spirit and eager mind a welcome challenge. In her free time, Jane explored the grounds, losing herself in the wild beauty of the gardens and the mysterious allure of the ancient trees. The wind whispered secrets as it rustled through the leaves, and Jane felt as if she were slowly uncovering the hidden heart of Thornfield. But even as she grew comfortable in her new role, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that Thornfield held secrets. Sometimes in the dead of night, strange laughter would echo from the third floor, sending shivers down her spine. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, jarring and unsettling in the stillness of the night. "Oh, that's just Grace Poole," Mrs. Fairfax would say with a forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "She's a bit peculiar." Jane nodded, but doubt gnawed at her like a persistent rodent. There was more to this story, she was sure of it. The walls of Thornfield seemed to hold their breath, keeping their secrets locked tight. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Jane found herself watching the shadows more closely. Every creak of the old house, every flickering candle flame seemed to hold a hidden meaning. Yet she focused on her duties, grateful for the freedom her new position afforded her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jane stood at her window. The grounds of Thornfield stretched out before her, bathed in the golden light of dusk. A sense of possibility unfurled within her, like a flower opening its petals to the dawn. Whatever mysteries Thornfield held, she was ready to face them head-on. As night fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky, Jane heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Her heart quickened as she peered into the gathering darkness. A lone rider approached, his figure obscured by the shadows. Could it be? Was the master of Thornfield finally returning home? Jane's breath caught in her throat as she prepared to face whatever the frosty evening might bring. Jane's first encounter with Mr. Rochester was a chance meeting on a frosty evening. As she walked along an icy lane, she came across a man who had fallen from his horse, unaware that he would soon become her employer. The winter air nipped at Jane's skin, turning her cheeks rosy as she trudged along the frozen path. Her breath formed delicate clouds in the twilight, dissipating into the gathering darkness. The rhythmic crunch of her footsteps on the frost-covered ground was the only sound that dared to break the eerie silence of the countryside. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a horse's panicked whinny, followed by a loud thud and a man's gruff curse. Jane's heart leaped into her throat, pounding furiously as she rushed towards the commotion. There, sprawled on the icy ground, lay a broad-shouldered man, his face hidden in shadow. His horse pawed nervously nearby, steam rising from its nostrils in the frigid air. "Are you hurt, sir?" Jane called out, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice despite her racing pulse. The man grunted, attempting to rise. "Nothing broken, save my pride," he growled, his voice deep and commanding, like thunder rolling across distant hills. Jane extended her hand, a small gasp escaping her lips as she felt the strength of his grip. He pulled himself up, and in the dim light, she caught a glimpse of dark, brooding eyes and a stern mouth set in a face etched with lines of experience. Something about his presence made her feel both unsettled and intrigued. Days passed, and the encounter faded from Jane's mind, like morning mist dissipating under the sun's warmth. That is, until she found herself face to face with her employer, Mr. Rochester. Recognition dawned like a bolt of lightning, illuminating her memories. This was the man from the lane. Their initial interactions crackled with tension, like the air before a storm. Rochester's brusque manner was unpredictable, his moods shifting as quickly as clouds across the sky. Yet Jane, though outwardly meek, stood her ground. She was like a young oak tree, bending in the wind but refusing to break. Rochester found himself intrigued by this slip of a woman who met his gaze unflinchingly. Their conversations became a dance of intellects, each step challenging societal norms and expectations. Jane's honesty was a breath of fresh air, cutting through the stifling atmosphere of Thornfield Hall like a cool breeze on a sweltering day. As winter melted into spring, Rochester began to share fragments of his past. He spoke of Adele's mother, a French opera dancer who had abandoned the child, his voice tinged with bitterness like the dregs of old wine. Jane listened, her heart aching for the pain she heard beneath his gruff exterior. Jane found herself drawn to Rochester's complexity like a moth to a flame. His intellect burned bright, casting light on corners of her mind she never knew existed. Yet the gulf between them, in age and station, yawned wide, a chasm she dared not cross. She stood at the edge, teetering between desire and duty, her heart racing with every glance they shared. Evenings at Thornfield took on a new rhythm. Rochester would summon Jane to the drawing room, where they'd lose themselves in discussions of art, literature, and philosophy. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, as Jane's mind blossomed under his attention. Her quiet strength was a match for his probing questions and mercurial moods, and she found herself looking forward to these encounters with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. But as the days lengthened, so did the shadows in Jane's heart. Her growing feelings for Rochester were like ivy, creeping silently but inexorably through the cracks in her carefully constructed walls. She struggled to maintain professional boundaries, even as her heart yearned to bridge the gap between them. Each night as she lay in her narrow bed, Jane's thoughts would drift to Rochester, his deep voice and intense gaze haunting her dreams. In the quiet moments when the candles burned low and the house settled into silence, Jane found herself torn. Her sense of propriety warred with the longing in her heart, creating a tempest of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her carefully cultivated calm. As she retired each night, her mind awhirl with thoughts of Rochester, Jane grappled with the growing inner turmoil that came with navigating the treacherous waters of her own heart. One evening, as Jane made her way back to her room after another intense conversation with Rochester, she paused at the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine as she heard what sounded like a muffled laugh echoing from somewhere in the depths of the house. She turned, heart pounding, to see a flicker of movement at the end of the corridor. Was it just a trick of the shadows or something more sinister? As Jane hurried to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right at Thornfield Hall, and that her growing closeness to Rochester might be leading her into unknown dangers. As Jane and Rochester's relationship blossomed, an unsettling atmosphere began to envelop Thornfield Hall. Strange and disturbing events started to unfold, casting a long shadow over their growing bond. The ancient stones of Thornfield seemed to whisper secrets in the dead of night. Jane found herself lying awake, her heart racing at every creak and groan of the old house. The once comforting corridors now felt like a maze of shadows, hiding untold mysteries. One fateful night, a blood-curdling laugh shattered the silence. Jane bolted upright, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-soaked skin. The sound echoed through the halls, a ghostly call that sent shivers down her spine. Her bare feet hit the cold floor as she crept from her bed, drawn by an inexplicable urge to investigate. The dim corridors closed in around her, the flickering candlelight casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The acrid smell of smoke assaulted her senses as she approached Rochester's chamber. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of her own ragged breathing. Horror gripped her as she flung open the door. Rochester's bed was engulfed in flames, the fire hungrily devouring the curtains. Without a second thought, Jane sprang into action. Her hands trembled as she doused the flames with water, the heat searing her skin. Rochester emerged from the smoke-filled room, his eyes wide with shock and gratitude. In that moment, as they stood amid the charred remains of the bed, their connection deepened. The air crackled with unspoken words and shared danger. "Jane," Rochester's voice was rough with emotion. "You've saved my life." His hand gripped hers, warm and strong. But when she pressed for answers, he offered only vague explanations, blaming Grace Poole's carelessness. Doubt gnawed at Jane, but her trust in Rochester outweighed her suspicions. She kept the incident to herself, a secret that burned in her heart like the embers of the extinguished fire. In the days that followed, an air of unease settled over Thornfield like a heavy fog. The halls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next calamity. Then, without warning, Rochester departed, leaving Jane adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. The emptiness of Thornfield echoed her own loneliness, each day stretching endlessly as she yearned for his return. Weeks crawled by, each one testing Jane's resolve. When Rochester finally returned, he brought with him a whirlwind of high society guests. Their laughter and chatter filled the once quiet halls, a jarring contrast to the somber atmosphere that had prevailed. Among the guests was Blanche Ingram, a woman whose beauty seemed to outshine the sun itself. Jane watched from the shadows, her heart constricting as Rochester and Blanche engaged in an elaborate courtship dance. Each smile Blanche directed at Rochester was like a dagger to Jane's heart, twisting deeper with every shared laugh and intimate conversation. Jane's emotions roiled like a turbulent sea, threatening to drown her in waves of jealousy and insecurity. She found herself comparing her plain appearance to Blanche's refined beauty, each comparison a fresh wound to her already battered self-esteem. The stark reality of their positions, Rochester the master, Jane the lowly governess, loomed large, an insurmountable obstacle to her deepest desires. As the days wore on, Jane's heartache grew, a constant ache in her chest that threatened to consume her. She convinced herself that Rochester intended to marry Blanche for her social status and beauty, relegating their own connection to nothing more than a fleeting fancy. The weight of her unrequited love pressed down on her, as heavy as the ancient stones of Thornfield itself. Amidst this emotional turmoil, a mysterious visitor arrived at Thornfield. Mr. Mason's presence seemed to unsettle Rochester, adding another layer of intrigue to the already tense atmosphere. Jane couldn't help but notice the furtive glances and hushed conversations that followed in his wake, each one fueling her growing suspicions. One night, as Jane tossed and turned in her bed, unable to sleep, a violent commotion erupted in the house. The sound of shattering glass and muffled shouts sent her heart racing. She rushed to investigate, only to be met by a grim-faced Rochester. His eyes burned with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her as he entrusted her with a secret task, to tend to Mr. Mason, who had been attacked and wounded. In the flickering candlelight of a hidden room, Jane carefully tended to Mason's injuries. The metallic scent of blood filled the air, mixing with the musty odor of the rarely used chamber. As she worked, her mind whirled with questions, but her loyalty to Rochester remained unshaken. The trust he placed in her, the weight of this shared secret, deepened their connection in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over Thornfield's weathered stones, Jane found herself more conflicted than ever. Her love for Rochester burned bright, a flame that refused to be extinguished despite the storm of doubts and fears that raged around her. Yet the realities of their positions loomed large, a seemingly insurmountable barrier to her heart's deepest desires. Jane struggled to reconcile her feelings with the harsh truths of her situation. She watched as Rochester and Blanche continued their courtship, each shared moment a fresh wound to her already battered heart. Despite her growing feelings, Jane grappled with the painful knowledge that her love for Rochester might forever remain unrequited, trapped within the confines of her position as a governess. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jane stood at her window, lost in thought. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her reverie. Her heart leapt as she recognized the purposeful stride echoing through the corridor. She turned, breath catching in her throat, as the door began to open. Mr. Rochester, now alone, sought out Jane with purpose in his step and fire in his eyes. The air around him crackled with an electric energy, his emotions barely contained beneath the surface of his stoic exterior. Jane sat in the library, her mind still whirling from the events of the past days. The soft rustle of pages turning did little to calm her racing thoughts. The sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor made her heart quicken. She knew those steps, firm and determined, belonging to none other than Mr. Rochester. He entered the room, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud, dark and unpredictable. The scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and spice, wafted towards her. "Jane," he said, his voice low and intense, sending shivers down her spine. "I can no longer keep my feelings hidden. I love you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jane's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Her heart soared, but doubt crept in like a shadow, cold and insistent. "Sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands trembling slightly. "How can that be? I am but a governess. And you—" Rochester cut her off, his words tumbling out like a river breaking through a dam. "You are my equal, Jane. In intellect, in spirit. You challenge me. You understand me like no other. I love you, and only you." His eyes, dark and intense, bore into hers, willing her to believe him. Jane's world tilted on its axis. Joy and disbelief warred within her, making her dizzy. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, but found only raw, honest emotion. The warmth of his gaze enveloped her, melting away her doubts. I, I love you too, she admitted, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly right on her tongue. Her cheeks flushed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. Rochester's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. He swept her into his arms, his embrace warm and secure. The solid strength of his body against hers felt like coming home. They began to plan their future, their words overlapping in their excitement, painting a picture of a life filled with love and companionship. "I'll continue as Adele's governess," Jane insisted, her independent spirit shining through even in her happiness. The thought of maintaining her own identity, even in marriage, filled her with a quiet pride. "Of course, my dear," Rochester agreed, his smile fond and indulgent. His fingers traced gentle patterns on her hand, each touch a promise of devotion. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and stolen moments of joy. Jane felt as though she were walking in a dream, too wonderful to be real. The halls of Thornfield seemed brighter, filled with the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. But reality came crashing down on their wedding day. The church, decorated with flowers and filled with anticipation, suddenly became a stage for tragedy. The sweet scent of roses turned cloying, almost suffocating in its intensity. As they stood before the altar, hands clasped and hearts full, a voice rang out, shattering the reverent silence. "Stop this wedding!" All heads turned to see Mr. Mason, his face pale and determined. "He cannot marry," Mason declared, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "Edward Rochester is already married. To my sister, Bertha Mason." The words fell like hammer blows. Jane felt the world spinning around her, Rochester's hand in hers the only anchor to reality. The cool metal of his ring pressed against her skin, a cruel reminder of what she was about to lose. Rochester's face contorted with anguish and rage. "Come," he growled, leading the shocked wedding party back to Thornfield. His grip on Jane's hand was almost painful, as if he feared she might slip away at any moment. Up they climbed to the attic Jane had always wondered about. Each step felt like a journey into darkness, the air growing thick and oppressive. The door creaked open, revealing a dark figure huddled in the corner. Grace Poole stood nearby, her face a mask of grim resignation. "This is my wife," Rochester said, his voice hollow. "Bertha Mason." The woman lunged forward, her eyes wild, her movements erratic. Jane recoiled, her mind struggling to comprehend the scene before her. The room reeked of neglect and despair, a stark contrast to the bright future she had imagined mere moments ago. Rochester's story poured out, a tale of deception and tragedy, tricked into marriage, bound by law and morality to a woman lost to madness. His eyes pleaded with Jane, begging for understanding. The pain in his gaze was almost tangible, reaching out to her like a physical force. "Stay with me," he implored, reaching for her hand. "We can still be together, still love each other." His voice cracked, raw with emotion. Jane's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She loved this man with every fiber of her being, but the price was too high. To stay would be to compromise everything she believed in, everything she was. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. With tears streaming down her face, she made her choice. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, but I must go." She turned and fled, leaving behind the only home and love she had ever known. Her footsteps echoed through the halls of Thornfield like the tolling of a funeral bell. Each step tore at her heart, but she forced herself to keep moving. As she burst through the front doors, the cool night air hit her face, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grounds. Jane paused for a moment, her chest heaving with sobs. She cast one last glance at the looming silhouette of Thornfield Hall, wondering if she would ever see it again. With a deep breath, she steeled herself and began to walk. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she made her way down the long drive. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, but with each step, a small spark of determination grew within her. She had no idea where she was going or what the future held, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Jane quickened her pace. The cool morning air nipped at her skin, sending shivers down her spine. She hurried down the road, her heart pounding with each step that took her further from the place she had called home. What lay ahead she did not know, but the journey had only just begun. The cool morning air nipped at Jane's skin, sending shivers down her spine. She hurried down the road, her heart pounding with each step that took her further from the place she had called home. The weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her, a constant companion as tangible as the small bundle of possessions clutched tightly to her chest. The world around her seemed a blur as Jane boarded a coach, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestone, a soothing counterpoint to her tumultuous thoughts. She watched the familiar landscape give way to unknown territories, each mile carrying her further from everything she had known. But all too soon, the meager coins in her purse ran out, leaving her to face the vast, unforgiving moors of northern England on foot. Days melted into one another as Jane trudged across the windswept landscape. The once vibrant young woman grew gaunt, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame like tattered flags in the relentless wind. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at her insides with sharp, insistent teeth. She foraged for berries, their tart juice a poor substitute for proper nourishment, and occasionally begged for scraps from the few isolated farmhouses she encountered. The moors, beautiful in their wild desolation, now seemed a cruel trap. Rolling hills of heather stretched endlessly in every direction, their purple blooms a stark contrast to the bleakness of Jane's situation. The wind whispered through the grass, sometimes sounding like distant voices calling her name. In her weakened state, Jane found herself wondering if she was slowly losing her grip on reality. As her strength waned, Jane's thoughts inevitably drifted to Rochester. The memory of his face, etched with lines of passion and sorrow, brought both comfort and anguish. His voice echoed in her mind, a bittersweet melody that refused to fade. She loved him still, with every fiber of her being, but the pain of their parting was a wound that refused to heal, raw and throbbing with each beat of her heart. On the brink of collapse, her vision swimming and her legs trembling beneath her, Jane stumbled upon Marsh End. The modest home, nestled among the rolling hills, seemed to shimmer like a mirage in the fading light. With the last reserves of her strength, she dragged herself to the doorstep. The rough wood beneath her fingers felt like salvation as consciousness slipped away, the world fading to black around her. The river's siblings, Diana, Mary, and St. John, discovered Jane's crumpled form and took her in without hesitation. In the days that followed, they nursed her back to health with gentle hands and kind words. The soft rustle of bed sheets and the quiet murmur of concerned voices slowly filtered through Jane's fevered dreams, anchoring her to the world of the living. As Jane slowly regained her strength, she found herself enveloped in a warmth she had rarely known. The scent of fresh baked bread and herbal teas permeated the air, a stark contrast to the harsh winds of the moors. Diana and Mary, with their quick wit and generous spirits, became the sisters Jane had always longed for. Their laughter filled the house, chasing away the shadows of Jane's recent ordeal like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. St. John, the austere clergyman, was a different matter entirely. His stern demeanor and unwavering devotion to his calling both impressed and unsettled Jane. He moved through the house like a statue come to life, his presence commanding respect and a touch of fear. Yet there was something in his ice-blue eyes that hinted at depths of passion, carefully contained beneath his cool exterior. As Jane recovered, St. John helped her secure a position as a teacher at a charity school in nearby Morton. It was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild her shattered world. Jane threw herself into her work, finding solace in the eager faces of her young pupils. The small schoolhouse with its worn desks and smoky fireplace became her sanctuary. Within its walls, she found purpose and pride in educating the village girls, many of whom had never before held a book. Jane adopted the name Jane Elliott, a shield to protect her from her past and the man she still loved but believed she must forget. Yet, in the quiet moments between lessons, she would sometimes catch herself tracing the letters of Rochester in the dust on her desk, only to hurriedly erase them as footsteps approached. In the quiet evenings at Marsh End, Jane often found herself lost in reflection. The crackling fire and the gentle scratch of St. John's pen as he worked became a backdrop to her swirling thoughts. She wrestled with her feelings for Rochester, the passion that still burned within her warring with her sense of morality and self-respect. The memory of his touch, his voice, his very essence, haunted her dreams and waking hours alike. St. John, observing Jane's inner turmoil with keen eyes, offered his own brand of comfort. Not warm embraces or soothing words, but intellectual discourse and spiritual guidance. Their conversations, ranging from philosophy to theology, provided Jane with a different kind of sustenance. It was like cool water to a parched throat, nourishing in its own way but lacking the intoxicating fire of her connection with Rochester. As the seasons changed and the moors bloomed with heather, Jane felt herself slowly healing. The pain of her past remained, a dull ache in her chest, but it no longer threatened to consume her. At Marsh End, surrounded by the kindness of the Rivers family, Jane began to contemplate her future. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled Thornfield in the dead of night, but a woman who had faced adversity and emerged stronger, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Jane's time at Marsh End became a period of profound self-discovery. In the simple rhythms of village life, in the companionship of her newfound family, she began to understand herself more deeply than ever before. As she built a new life, teaching by day and sharing quiet evenings with the Rivers siblings, Jane found a measure of peace. Yet even as she looked to the future, a part of her heart remained tethered to the past, to the man she had left behind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, St. John approached Jane with an unusually serious expression. His eyes, typically cool and distant, now burned with an intensity that made Jane's breath catch in her throat. He gestured for her to join him by the fire, his voice low and urgent as he began to speak. "Jane, there is something of great importance I must discuss with you." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room as Jane sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, each beat echoing the weight of St. John's unspoken words. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room as Jane sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, each beat echoing the weight of St. John's words. The air felt thick, charged with the electricity of revelation. "Cousins," Jane whispered, the word foreign on her tongue. She looked up at St. John, his usually stern face softened by the warm glow of the firelight. "How can this be?" St. John leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Our mutual uncle, Jane Eyre, has passed away in Madeira." He paused, his eyes searching Jane's face. "But there's more, Jane. You've inherited a substantial sum, £20,000. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Jane gripped the arms of her chair, feeling as if she might float away. £20,000. The sum was beyond her wildest dreams, a fortune that could change everything. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The scent of wood smoke and old books filled her nostrils, grounding her in the moment. When she opened her eyes, the world looked different, brighter somehow, full of possibility. For the first time in her life, Jane felt the warmth of belonging wash over her. She was no longer alone in the world. She had family. She had means. "I want to share it," Jane said suddenly, her voice stronger than she expected. "The inheritance. I want to divide it equally among us all." St. John's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Jane, are you certain?" She nodded, words tumbling out in a rush. "5,000 each. For you, Diana, Mary, and myself. You could leave your positions as governesses. You could pursue your dream of becoming a missionary, St. John." As she spoke, Jane watched the impact of her words ripple across St. John's face. The stern lines softened, and for a moment, she glimpsed a vulnerability she'd never seen before. A connection sparked between them, deeper than their newfound familial ties. In the days that followed, Jane's world transformed. She closed the village school, her heart heavy as she bid farewell to her students, but excitement thrummed through her veins at the prospect of what lay ahead. Her new home, a small cottage nearby, became her sanctuary. Each morning she woke to birdsong, the melody a reminder of her newfound freedom. The cottage walls soon filled with books, their pages whispering of far-off lands and profound ideas. Jane lost herself in their words, her mind expanding with each turn of a page. As autumn leaves turned golden and fell, Jane noticed a shift in St. John's demeanor. His gaze lingered longer, held a new intensity. Where once he had seen her as a fellow teacher and friend, now there was something more. Something that both intrigued and unsettled her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a riot of pink and gold, Jane stood at her cottage window, the cool glass pressed against her forehead as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From orphan to heiress, from solitude to family. The inheritance had changed more than just her material circumstances. It had shifted the very foundation of her world. As darkness fell, Jane's thoughts turned to St. John. His recent behavior, the lingering looks, the subtle changes in his tone when he spoke to her. It all swirled in her mind like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. What did it mean? And more importantly, how did she feel about it? A soft knock at the door startled Jane from her reverie. Her heart leapt into her throat as she recognized the tall, imposing silhouette through the frosted glass. St. John stood on her doorstep, his face unreadable in the gathering gloom. What could have brought him here at this hour? And why did his presence suddenly fill her with a mixture of anticipation and dread? With trembling fingers, Jane reached for the door handle, unaware that the conversation about to unfold would change the course of her life once again. St. John Rivers had been keenly observing Jane over the past weeks. Her intelligence and dedication had left a profound impression on him. The air hung heavy with anticipation as St. John approached Jane one golden afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Jane looked up from her book, her dark eyes curious as St. John cleared his throat. "Jane," he began, his voice steady but tinged with an unusual warmth, "I believe God has a greater purpose for you. Will you come with me to India as my wife and fellow missionary?" The words seemed to echo in the suddenly still room. Jane's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The warm glow of the afternoon light dimmed, as if the weight of the decision before her had physical presence. St. John's eyes blazed with fervor as he continued, "You possess the qualities necessary for this divine calling. Together, we could do God's work, spreading his word to those in need." Jane's mind whirled like autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind. She respected St. John deeply, admired his unwavering faith and dedication. But as she searched his face, looking for a spark of romantic love, she found only the cool flame of religious zeal. I'm honored by your proposal, St. John," Jane said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt thick in her mouth, like honey that had crystallized. "But I fear I cannot accept. I would gladly accompany you to India as your assistant, but not as your wife." A shadow of disappointment flitted across St. John's face, his brow furrowing. "Jane, don't you see? Only as my wife can you truly fulfill God's purpose. This is not about earthly love, but a higher calling." His words, though meant to inspire, felt like icy fingers closing around Jane's heart. She turned away, gazing out the window at the wild moors beyond. The wind whispered through the heather, seeming to echo her inner turmoil. The vast expanse of purple and green stretched to the horizon, a symbol of the freedom she yearned for. Days passed, each one feeling longer than the last. St. John's proposal hung over Jane like a storm cloud, dark and ominous. She found herself torn between her desire to be useful, to make a difference in the world, and her deep-seated need for emotional fulfillment. The thought of a loveless marriage, even one dedicated to a noble cause, left her feeling hollow, like a tree stripped of its leaves. One evening, as twilight painted the moors in shades of purple and gold, Jane stood at her window, the cool glass pressed against her forehead as she gazed out, her heart heavy with indecision. The scent of heather drifted through the open window, a bitter-sweet reminder of the wild beauty that surrounded her. Suddenly, a strange sensation washed over her, as if the very air around her had changed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, a shiver running down her spine. Then she heard it, a voice carried on the wind calling her name. "Jane! Jane!" It was a cry of anguish, of desperate longing, and she knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that it was Rochester's voice. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. How was this possible? Rochester was miles away, yet his voice rang in her ears as clearly as if he stood beside her. It was a moment that defied explanation, a mystical experience that sent shivers down her spine and set her heart racing. In that instant, clarity washed over Jane like a cleansing rain. Her heart, which had been clouded by doubt and duty, now beat with renewed purpose. She could not marry St. John, could not commit herself to a life devoid of the passionate love she had once known. With trembling hands, Jane began to pack her meager belongings. Her decision was made. She would return to Thornfield, to learn of Rochester's fate, and to follow the calling of her heart. Each item she placed in her bag felt like a step towards her true destiny. The next morning, Jane sought out the Rivers family. The pale light of dawn cast long shadows as she stood before them, her resolve firm despite the bittersweet ache in her chest. The air was crisp, filled with the promise of a new day and new beginnings. "I must go," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling within her. "I am grateful beyond words for your kindness, for the home you have given me, but my path lies elsewhere." Diana and Mary embraced her warmly, their eyes shining with tears. The scent of their familiar perfumes mingled with the fresh morning air, a poignant reminder of the home she was leaving behind. St. John stood apart, his face a mask of stoic acceptance. As Jane turned to leave, he spoke softly. "May God guide your steps, Jane Eyre." With a final glance at the place that had been her sanctuary, Jane stepped out into the misty morning. The moors stretched before her, wild and full of promise, as she set out to reclaim her destiny. The dew-covered grass crunched beneath her feet, each step taking her closer to an uncertain future. As Jane walked away from the Rivers home, her heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The path ahead was unclear, shrouded in mist like the moors around her. What awaited her at Thornfield? Would Rochester still be there? And if he was, what state would she find him in? These questions swirled in her mind as she took her first steps on the long journey back to Thornfield Hall. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint echo of that mysterious call. "Jane, Jane!" It seemed to urge her forward, drawing her back to a place she once called home, and to a man who still held her heart. Jane's heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She journeyed back to Thornfield Hall, each step bringing her closer to the place she once called home. The familiar road stretched before her, a ribbon of memories unfurling beneath her feet. The air was thick with the scent of autumn, crisp leaves crunching under her boots as she walked. As she crested the final hill, the sight that greeted her was like a blow to the chest. Where once stood the grand manor of Thornfield Hall, now lay a blackened ruin. The skeletal remains of the once proud building reached towards the sky like gnarled fingers, a haunting monument to what was lost. Jane stumbled forward, her legs suddenly weak, her mind reeling with questions. The air around the ruins was heavy with the acrid scent of smoke and decay. Jane's eyes darted frantically over the devastation, searching for any sign of life amidst the charred rubble. Each step she took kicked up ashes, the remnants of a life she had left behind swirling around her ankles like ghostly tendrils. Desperate for answers, Jane found herself at the local inn. The innkeeper's face grew grave as she inquired about Thornfield's fate. His words fell like hammer blows, each revelation more shocking than the last. "It was a terrible night, miss," the innkeeper began, his voice hushed and eyes distant. "Bertha Mason, Mr. Rochester's wife, she lost her mind completely, set fire to the house, she did, and then—" He paused, swallowing hard. "She jumped from the roof, didn't survive the fall." Jane's world tilted on its axis. Bertha, the mad woman in the attic, the secret that had torn her and Rochester apart, was gone. But at what cost? The room seemed to spin around her, the innkeeper's words echoing in her ears like a mournful bell. The innkeeper continued, his words painting a vivid picture of that fateful night. Rochester, driven by desperation and perhaps a sliver of redemption, had fought through the inferno to save his wife and the servants. Jane's heart clenched as she learned of his injuries. One hand lost, both eyes blinded, his face scarred by the merciless flames. The news settled over Jane like a heavy cloak, suffocating and inescapable. She stood motionless, her mind struggling to reconcile the Rochester she knew, proud, commanding, vibrant, with this broken man the innkeeper described. Yet beneath the shock and sorrow, a flame of determination flickered to life in her chest. Without hesitation, Jane set out for Ferndean Manor, a secluded house nestled deep in the woods where Rochester had retreated. The journey seemed endless, each step weighted with anticipation and fear. What would she find? How would he receive her? The forest around her seemed to close in, branches reaching out like grasping hands, the path ahead shrouded in mist and uncertainty. As Ferndean emerged from the misty woods, Jane's resolve strengthened. The house stood like a sentinel, its weathered stones a testament to endurance. She approached the door, her heart thundering in her chest, the sound of her knocking echoing in the stillness. Their reunion was a storm of emotions: shock, joy, disbelief, and an overwhelming love that had only grown stronger in their time apart. Rochester, once proud and commanding, now sat before her, humbled by fate and isolation. His unseeing eyes searched for her, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke her name. Jane moved to him, her hands gently cradling his face. She could feel the raised scars beneath her fingertips, a map of his suffering etched into his skin. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I've come home to you." Rochester's expression was a mixture of wonder and vulnerability. "Jane," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can it truly be you? Have you returned to this broken man?" "You are not broken," Jane declared fiercely, her words cutting through the gloom of the room like a shaft of sunlight. "You are changed, as am I, but my love for you remains unaltered, perhaps even stronger." As they spoke, the barriers between them crumbled like the walls of Thornfield. Jane's inheritance and Rochester's reduced circumstances had leveled the playing field that once separated them. In this quiet woodland retreat, they were simply two souls, long parted, now reunited. Rochester's hand found hers, clinging to it like a lifeline. His fingers, once so sure and strong, now trembled slightly in her grasp. "Jane," he said, his voice trembling with hope and fear, could you consider binding your life to mine? Not out of pity, but as my wife, my equal, my dearest love?" In that moment, all the pain and separation of the past melted away. Jane's heart soared, and with joy radiating through every fiber of her being, she gave her answer. "Yes, Edward. 1,000 times yes." As the words left her lips, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows of Ferndean. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Jane felt a shiver run down her spine, a strange premonition settling over her. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the warmth of Rochester's hand in hers. Yet as they sat together in the gathering dusk, she couldn't shake the sense that their journey was far from over. What challenges would their union face? What secrets still lurked in the shadows of their past? As night fell over Ferndean, Jane found herself both elated and uneasy, standing on the threshold of a new chapter in her life. Jane and Rochester's wedding was a quiet, intimate affair. Their union, now one of equals, was built on a foundation of mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and profound love. The newlyweds found their sanctuary in Ferndean, a secluded manor embraced by ancient trees. As they approached, the weathered stone walls and ivy-covered facades seemed to welcome them, whispering promises of peace and new beginnings. The crunch of gravel under their carriage wheels faded into the gentle rustle of leaves, nature's own applause for their arrival. Inside, the house breathed with history, its wooden floors creaking softly under their feet, as if sharing secrets of past inhabitants. Jane's heart swelled with a mix of excitement and trepidation as she crossed the threshold, Rochester's hand warm and steady in hers. From the first light of dawn, Jane devoted herself to Rochester's care with unwavering dedication. Each morning she guided him through the dewy gardens, her voice painting the world he could no longer see. "The roses are in full bloom today, my love," she'd say, her words as soft as the petals she described. "Their scent is intoxicating, like the sweetness of our new life together." The library became their shared haven. Surrounded by the comforting smell of old books and polished wood, Jane's melodious voice brought stories to life. She'd pause often, relishing the intellectual sparring that followed. "What do you make of the protagonist's choice, Edward?" she'd ask, her eyes bright with curiosity. Rochester's deep chuckle would fill the room. "Ah, Jane, always pushing me to think deeper." I believe. As summer faded into autumn, a change blossomed in Rochester. His laughter, once a rare treasure, now echoed through Ferndean's halls with increasing frequency. It was as if Jane's love was a balm, slowly healing wounds both seen and unseen. One crisp morning, as golden leaves danced outside the window, Rochester gasped. His hand, calloused yet gentle, reached for Jane with trembling urgency. "My dear," he whispered, voice thick with emotion, I can see a glimmer of light in my left eye." Jane's heart leapt, hope unfurling in her chest like a banner. She cupped his face, tears of joy threatening to spill. "Oh, Edward," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The months that followed were a whirlwind of cautious optimism and small victories. Rochester's sight in his left eye improved gradually, defying the grim predictions of doctors. It was as if their love had worked a miracle, proving that the heart could indeed influence the healing of the body. Their joy reached its zenith with the birth of their son. As Rochester cradled the infant, tears glistening in his partially restored eye, Jane felt a completeness she had never known. The baby's coos filled Ferndean with a new melody, a song of family and belonging that Jane had yearned for all her life. Across vast oceans, St. John Rivers pursued his calling in India. His letters arrived like clockwork, filled with tales of exotic lands and challenging experiences. Jane would read them aloud to Rochester, her voice tinged with a mix of admiration for her cousin's dedication and gratitude for the path she had chosen. Diana and Mary, Jane's newfound family, settled near Ferndean, their presence a soothing balm to Jane's once lonely soul. Sundays became a celebration of kinship, with laughter and warmth filling Ferndean's sun-drenched parlor. As seasons changed, Jane and Rochester's love deepened like roots finding rich soil. They faced Rochester's disabilities together, their bond strengthening with each challenge overcome. In quiet moments, Jane would often reflect on her journey, from the determined orphan girl to the woman who had found her home in love. Their marriage was a harmonious symphony, each partner complementing the other perfectly. Rochester's wisdom melded with Jane's strength, his passion with her steadfastness, creating a love that seemed to transcend the ordinary. As twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Jane and Rochester sat in their favorite spot in the garden. The air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, a sweet reminder of the beauty that can flourish in darkness. "Jane," Rochester said, his voice soft with wonder, "do you ever marvel at the journey that brought us here?" Jane squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Every day, my love, every single day." As night fell gently around Ferndean, stars peeking through the canopy of trees, Jane knew with unshakable certainty that this love, this life, was where she truly belonged. Their story stood as a testament to the power of true love, a love that, having weathered separation and hardship, emerged stronger than ever, bringing with it a deep and abiding contentment that would fill their days for years to come.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.